rumours were spread amongst the Protestant population that if they allowed them within the city walls, they would all be massacred. So as the Catholic soldiers, of which this very gate behind me here, very key gate, in December of 1688, 13 young apprentice boys rushed forward to close the gates in the faces of the Catholic soldiers, shouting those two immortal words, "No surrender," and thus began the longest siege ever in British military history, lasting 105 days. Now, it did not begin straight away in December. It really was April of the following year, 1689. At that stage, King James himself had arrived here to the city in person from France, with a French army, the Jacobite supporters and Catholic supporters, and totally surrendered the whole city. And he rode up to Bishop Gate, where we'll go to shortly, along with some French soldiers, called upon the citizens up on the wall to admit the lawful king, called upon them to surrender. He again said, "No surrender," and a volley of shots was fired from Bishop Gate, killing some of those French soldiers. And that was the start of the famous siege. In the meantime, between December and April, all the Protestant people for miles and miles around had gathered within the city walls, and the city became known as a city of refuge for Protestants. They were sensible enough themselves to realise that without help they would not be able to stand a long siege. So naturally they sent to London for help. There's a gentleman called Captain Browning, who's familiar with the river, tides and seas. And he appeared over in London and said, "I'm here from the city of Londonderry. We are under attack by the Catholic forces of King James. If you do not help us, the city will be lost." So the London merchants organised 3 ships as quickly as they could, loaded them up with foodstuffs, munitions and soldiers, and sent them back into the city. Those ships are right back in the river, about 2 miles downstream from where we're standing now, where the river is narrow. These ships were met by a wooden boom built across them. This was a construction of 3 trunks lashed together that initially prevented the sailing ships reaching the city. But after a period of time, they were able to hack their way through, and they sailed up to Ship Quay Gate on the 12th of August, 1689. And that was called the Relief of Derry. And that was basically the end of the siege. After 105 days between April and August, the longest ever in British military history. The famous Battle of the Boyne, when King William, the Protestant king, defeated King James, the Catholic king, down at the River Boyne, north of Dublin. And that is the reason, ladies and gentlemen, why the Orange Men march here in Northern Ireland every year on the 12th of July is to celebrate that famous victory. Are you familiar with the term Orange Men? It is an exclusively Protestant marching organisation in memory of King William of Orange. He came from Holland, he was Dutch, the House of Orange, orange being their national colour. Here in Derry, we have another exclusively Protestant marching organisation called the Apprentice Boys of Derry, and they march twice a year. The march in December to celebrate the closing of this gate, and the march in August to celebrate the relief of the city when the ships arrived from London. That's the historical significance of why they march. During the siege itself, it is estimated up to 7,000 people lost their lives. They died mostly from starvation and disease. It was one of these classical type sieges. By that I mean bombarding out, bombarding in with cannon and musket, little or no hand-to-hand fighting, although there were some skirmishes. And the best way I could explain this to you is to say it's a lack of trust or a lack of confidence in their fellow Catholic citizens and neighbours. Again, the historic words, "No surrender." You will find these 2 words written in Protestant areas all over Northern Ireland, and they were first used in at that gate in December of 1688. Very iconic words from the Protestant point of view.
UK and English.
People lost their lives, so mass graves would have been the order of the day. Now, the cathedral is the oldest building here in Northern Ireland, and this city of Derry in particular. A lot of the Catholic gentlemen decided they did not have all the rights that they should have as citizens of the United Kingdom, so they set up their own civil rights movement based on peaceful protest. They had 3 simple demands. They wanted 1 man, 1 vote, proper access to public housing, proper access to jobs. At that particular time, the Londonderry City Council was always composed of 20 members. 12 of these were always Protestant, 8 were always Catholic, even though the Catholics were the overwhelming majority of the local population. This was done by a process called gerrymandering, which was a manipulation of the ward boundary and also to do with property ownership. If you had 6 properties, you had 6 votes. If you had no property, you had no vote. Ooh. That is not the way the system worked in Liverpool or Manchester or Glasgow, but that's how it worked here. Secondly, the quality of the public housing in both Catholic and Protestant working class areas was very, very poor. Third world standard on many occasions. And thirdly, Catholics always said that when it came to getting jobs in the government or civil service type jobs, they were always underrepresented in relation to their numbers in the population. So what started off as a very, very peaceful protest by the leading citizens of the city, dressed in their suits and their collars and ties, was very, very harshly treated by the police. They were actually baton charged off the street. But this was caught on TV camera for the first time ever by a man called O'Brien from RTE television in Dublin. And this was shown around the world. And suddenly people started to ask questions about what the hell's going on there in Derry that makes it so different than everywhere else. And as we say here locally, the cat was out of the bag, never ever to go back in. What happened next is the marches got larger, more sinister elements became involved, and basically law and order completely broke down. The British Army had to be called in to keep the peace, and they were initially very much welcomed by the Catholic community as their saviours. But I'm afraid the honeymoon period did not last too long. They were then seen as the oppressors. Next thing the government did was introduce a law called internment without trial. This meant you could be arrested and held indefinitely without any evidence whatsoever against you. And this law was very, very much resented by the Catholic community, and the British government have admitted on numerous occasions since then that that was the single biggest mistake they made in their whole handling of the situation at that extremely volatile time. I'm talking about a period there, 1968 to 1971. Does everybody follow that okay?
Yeah.
That is really the build-up to Bloody Sunday, which I want to come to in a few minutes' time, where we actually overlook the Bogside area. The King James himself came in April of 1689. He rode up here along with some French soldiers, called upon the citizens up on the walls to admit the lawful king, called upon them to surrender. He again said, no surrender, and a volley of shots was fired in this direction, killing some of those French soldiers, and that was the start of the famous siege. This green fence is what we call a peace line, and that separates that small Protestant Franklin area there from their Catholic neighbours. That goes right round the whole way. The only access to this area is through the main business thoroughfare. Now, that fence would have been needed in years gone by, because there would have been troubles associated with the Orange marches and the Princess Boys marches. But that problem has been resolved here in this city in recent years by the local businessmen. The tower you see in the distance is the last remnants of what was the old Derry jail. A very, very large jail that used to cover a lot of that area where the new housing was built. But it had to be closed down in 1952 for one very important reason. It was said that it was easier to get out of it than to get into it. There had been mass breakouts in the early 1940s during other periods of internment, 28 people on one occasion. At least 12 IRA bomb attacks against this building during the course of the Troubles, and as a result of that, some of the most beautiful stained glass windows in the cathedral behind were destroyed. But please God, ladies and gentlemen, those days are long behind us, never to return. Pink building on the other side is the Bishop's Palace in the Masonic Hall. This building had one very famous lady resident, a lady called Ceol Frances Alexander. She was the wife of one of the bishops, and when she lived here in the late 1800s, she wrote a lot of wonderful hymns that are sung in churches and cathedrals all over the world, right to the present time. Amongst those would be The Green Hill Far Away, Once in Royal David City, and perhaps her most famous hymn written for a younger audience was All Things Bright and Beautiful, All Creatures Great and Small. The Battle of the Bogside, a 3-day riot in this area we'll look at next. And this riot now began after an apprentice boys' march on the 12th of August. They carried on for 3 days and 3 nights. The police were absolutely exhausted. So when the British soldiers did arrive in the Siege of Derry, they were made very welcome by the Catholic community with cups of tea, biscuits, all the normal hospitalities. And I remember a British Army officer saying at that time that they hoped that the situation sorted out in about 6 to 8 weeks. He was being very optimistic. 38 years later, they have eventually left. You may or may not have been aware, but there was a very large religious service held over in St Paul's Cathedral in London, Christmas 11 years ago, attended by Prince Charles and all the top-ranking army officers to mark what they called the conclusion to the Northern Ireland campaign. It's only then when you reflect and think back that you realise that almost 800 British Army soldiers lost their lives here in Northern Ireland during the course of those troubles. Now in this area down here, on the 30th of January 1972, there was a very large civil rights march attended by over 15,000 people. They were marching for one reason and one reason only. That was an anti-internment march. putting people in prison without evidence. That's why they were protesting that day. Now, the march had been banned by the government from taking place. Then it had been banned from going into the city centre. But the march went ahead, nevertheless, down here in the Bogside area, ended up in front of this white gable wall here called Free Derry Club. As the meeting was progressing down here, some young men before the junction of that road over there started to throw stones and rocks at the British Army. Now, there was nothing unusual about that. That was a regular daily occurrence in this location. It had been going on for years. Believe it or not, it was a regular occurrence. Used to refer to it as recreational rioting. What happened next is in dispute. The British Army claimed they were fired on first. What happened after that is not in dispute. It is well documented in all the tribunals. In the next 20-minute period, the British Army mounted an arrest operation against the people who were protesting and demonstrating, and they fired 108 live bullets. As a result of that, 13 people lay dead or dying. One died some months later, and 14 others were seriously wounded. And that day has become internationally known as Bloody Sunday. But up there in the distance, you see the multicoloured view of the Dove of Peace. About 100 metres this side of the Dove of Peace is where most of the shootings and woundings occurred, in a very, very confined area. Now, there used to be high-rise flats there called the Rossville Street Flats that have since been demolished. Now, after that, we had a tribunal of inquiry called the Widgery Tribunal under Lord Chief Justice Widgery. There, the British Army claimed they fired only at gunmen, nail bombers and petrol bombers. Now, the relatives of the people who were killed and those who were wounded said they were not nail bombers, petrol bombers or gunmen, and therein lies the problem. Now, this tribunal has been deemed to be a whitewash, not by me, but by the British government themselves, because quite simply, nobody believed it. And what we've now had, for the first time ever in British legal history, has been a second inquiry to Bloody Sunday called the Savile Inquiry, under Lord Chief Justice Savile, who together with a Canadian judge and an Australian judge, had sat down in the Guildhall in the city for over 4 years, went over all the sad events of that day, finished up towards the end of 2004. And believe it or not, this report was made public on the 15th of June 2010, just over 8 years ago, at long, long last. In a very choreographed day, on the 15th of June, at precisely 3:30, the British Prime Minister, Mr. David Cameron, got up in the House of Commons in London to address the nation. His speech was carried worldwide on all the major news channels. It was the #1 news item all over the world that day. He said that what happened on the day of Bloody Sunday was unjustified and unjustifiable. He said it was wrong, and he apologised in a very statesmanlike manner for what happened on that day. Now, that was a huge weight lifted from the combined soul of this city to have that wrong right, even after so many years. It was, in my opinion, a very good day for Derry, very good day for Ireland, and also a very good day for England. Make no mistake about that. The very next morning then, here in our city, the Protestant Bishop of the city, Dr. Good, together with the Presbyterian minister and the Methodist minister, went down here to the Bogside where the memorial is to the people who died that day, to meet the Catholic relatives. And Dr. Good made a wonderful presentation, what we call the hands across the divide. Have you seen the two statues at the bridge? That represents Catholic and Protestant reconciliation. It's a model of that was handed by the Protestant bishop to the Catholic relatives. Now, symbolism in our city does not get much better than that. The following Friday then, in our local paper, the Derry Journal, a lady called Mrs. McGuigan, whose husband was the last person to be shot dead on the day of Bloody Sunday, and he was never spoken publicly from that day to this about the situation, said that she was very satisfied with the outcome of the Savile Inquiry. And she said that if Mr. Cameron was in this city, she would invite him to her house for a cup of tea. I could not sum it up any better myself. It is time to move on. It is amazing that you wait 30 odd years for a bus to come along, then two come along at the one time. Since then, the city's had some more good fortune in the fact that we have been honoured with the title of UK City of Culture for the year 2013, which was the 400th anniversary of the building of these fantastic walls we're standing on top of here today. And our tourism figures went through the roof. And we have been asked to consolidate. So please, please spread the word wherever you are from that Derry is open for business. And on that basis, I'm promoting you all straight away to ambassadorial status. It's called The Death of Innocence. It tells the story of a 14-year-old schoolgirl called Annette McGavigan, who was sent out by her parents to the grocery store. While she was out, a gun battle broke out between the British Army behind the walls and IRA gunmen in the housing below. She got caught in the middle, was shot twice in the head and died as a result. This is meant to be a memorial to all children, Catholic or Protestant, who were hurt or killed during the Troubles, and there were many. You see the right and left hand side now broken. That's a sign that the guns been got rid of. and the butterfly there above our shoulders used to be painted very dull colours. But the artists always said, looking back, and put in the beautiful colours of the butterfly whenever we had meaningful piece here in Northern Ireland. And I am delighted to say that that was done a few years ago in a great haze of local publicity. Now, Annette was the first child victim of the Troubles and the first young person to die in this city in 1971. At that stage, she was actually the 100th person to die in what we call the Troubles. And when you think that over 3,600 more people have died since then, and almost 50,000 people have been injured in this small area that we call Northern Ireland, then you really must ask yourself, what was it all about? Or how could it be justified? And I pose that as a general question to all my visitors to make them think a little bit deeper about this whole situation. Now, this mural would also have an international significance in the sense that no matter where in the world there's trouble or conflict, it's always the innocent who suffer. Over 10 years ago, to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington to reproduce that peace mural, which shows you how highly their art is regarded at the present time. Multiple family occupancy, major social issues, endemic unemployment, and the high flats now all gone. Vitally important that in mind, because when you think back what the civil rights people were actually looking for was votes, jobs and houses. Before the men of violence became involved, things like Bloody Sunday, where it basically became uncontrollable. Fishmongers, London, 1642, called after a fishwife called Meg. Of course, these fishwives had another reputation. They were also ladies of the night. It wasn't only poor Molly Malone up in Dublin, when you went to call her statue up in Dublin, the tart with the cart. But somebody correctly said, no, John, was the tart with the heart. 10 years ago, there was loads and loads of cameras, Big Brother watching, all focused down in the Catholic Bogside area, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Highly resented by the local community. See all that gone now is like the proverbial monkey off her back. A special story for all my lady guests. When you talk about the top models in the world, the Naomi Campbells and the Kate Mosses, walking on the catwalks of Milan, Paris and New York, you ladies now have the privilege of walking on the original catwalk. This is where the word comes from. What you would have had here on the Sabbath or on the Sunday would have been the wealthy merchants and businessmen of the city, walking up and down with their wives or their girlfriends, all dressed in their beautiful clothes, all trying to outdo each other. And all the poor people down here shouting up, look at all them cats up there on the walk. So stop your stuff, ladies. You might never walk this way again. We hope to see you all back on a regular basis. To keep the native Irish people out. And you could say that they succeeded, and you could say that the native Irish people went on to become the rebels in their own country. Now, if you think the name of the city is confusing, and we call it Derry or we call it Londonderry, the city also has another name. It's known as the Maiden City. And the reason it is referred to as the Maiden City is because its walls have withstood 3 different sieges and never been breached. So who said we don't have a sense of humour? But at that time, the whole numbers game in the city changed forever. It became a Catholic majority city and an increasing one there afterwards, but they were never allowed to control the economics or the politics. And that all blew up in our faces in the Troubles in the late 60s. A local historian said that at the end of World War II, there were 10 generals in the British Army. 6 of the 10 generals came from the north of Ireland. Incredible. Not talk about Bradley and Patton, the American generals. So the Fighting Irish is a reputation well earned, I can assure you. It's not just a football team called Notre Dame. As you know, the one thing that they always say about the Irish is that we make great friends, but terrible bloody enemies. I think there's a certain truth in that myself. Never know when we're beaten, never know when to give in. We've had some of the most peaceful matches that we have ever had. And please God, that is the way forward. A bit of tolerance, a bit of give and take. That is a historical fact. And they launched a massive bombing campaign here in this city throughout the 1970s, with the bombs going off on a very regular basis. But the city was in really poor shape at the end of the 70s. They usually tell a couple of wee stories that might convey that message to you in an interesting way. One morning in 1976, a little old lady living out here in William Street, just outside the city walls, she heard a very loud bang! And she came rushing out of her house and she said to a man walking by, "Ha, Jimmy, what was that loud bang?" "Ah, don't worry your head, Maggie," he said. "It's just another bomb going off up the town." be to God. I thought it was thunder. But that whole siege mentality, that whole no surrender, all that psychology relates very much to this historic walled city you're standing in the dead centre of today. Let's go back around the Ferry Quay Gate. I'll tell a few more stories about World War II, and then we'll all go get a nice complimentary cup of coffee, and you can plan the rest of your day. So I kept that long, lonesome battle going against them. Now, unfortunately, they were all taken out and sunk and scuttled. They're used for target practice on the Royal Coast of Ireland. Nobody had the foresight to keep a few of them. I mean, that'd be a magnificent centrepiece for a maritime museum. But unfortunately, that has not happened. As we say around here, there's no point in crying over spilt milk. What's done is done.